plane can be shown to be just the dislocation density rho. The line length of dislocation per unit volume is also statistically equal to the number of dislocation intersections in any plane. So if we're hardening with dislocations like work hardening, then n is equal to rho, and the obstacle strength is about 10 times as great as for solute atoms. It's of the order of 0.1. If the other obstacles we use are precipitates. Now, precipitates come in various sizes and offer various resistances. Some precipitates, if they're coherent with the matrix, the dislocation can actually cut right through them because it can exist in the crystal structure of the precipitate as well as the crystal structure of the matrix. Others, the dislocation gets stopped and has to go around in some way or another. For various reasons, the obstacle strength of a dislocation, a precipitate can range from around 0.1 up to a maximum value of 0.7. Can't get above 0.7 because of, well, the phenomenon I'll show you in just a minute. And here the root of n is just 1 over ls, where ls is the spacing between precipitates. So when you're hardening materials, solute atoms are very easy to use for hardening. They're not terribly effective. Solution hardening is not it's used all over the place in metallurgy, but it's not terribly effective. Dislocation hardening is work hardening. You deform a material, it's harder, and you can use that strength, and that's dislocation hardening. And finally, precipitation hardening. Now, in the case of dislocations, this critical resolve shear stress ends up being to GB times a factor, something like 0.1 to the 3 halves times the square root of rho, which is the dislocation density. And that's what's called the universal hardening law. If you deform a material so that you increase the dislocation density, it's just in almost any material, the strength that you get out, critical resolve shear stress, is going to turn out to be proportional to GB root rho, where rho is the dislocation density. And that applies in material after material and situation after situation. Very useful and also kind of surprising if you look at the complexity of the behavior of arrays of dislocations. People have been trying, Livermore's had a program on big computers now for 20 years to try and actually do good simulations of arrays of dislocations and how they evolve. An enormously difficult problem. But in practical terms, if you don't care about the second significant figure, the critical resolve shear stress is just GB root rho, and rho is just the overall dislocation density, and that works very, very well. All right, solute hardening, let me go through these mechanisms one by one. The classic source of solution hardening is the following. It's fairly easy to understand. Suppose we have a solute out here in the lattice. The solute's going to be either too big or too little for the hole that it's in. So there's always going to be some elastic strain associated with that solute. Well, the dislocation also carries elastic strain. An edge dislocation, above the dislocation, because you squeeze an extra plane in here, this will be under compression. Below the dislocation, this will be under tension. Now suppose the dislocation approaches a solute. If the solute is too big, it will be attracted to this region of tension and repelled by that region of compression. Either way, it will pin the dislocation. If the solute is attracted to the dislocation, then the dislocation will find it fairly easy to get to the solute, but will have considerable difficulty separating from the solute to move on, because the solute is attracted to that region of tension. If this is a region of compression, then the dislocation will have trouble getting to the solute, because the solute will repel it. So whether the solute is too big or too little, putting any solute into a material is going to have a strengthening effect. It's going to make it difficult for dislocations to move. Well, how big is that effect going to be? If the solute is a substitutional species, it really is hard to get much solution strengthening, because substitutional species, the misfits are just never all that big. Take the biggest element you can find, a rare earth of some kind or another, put it into even aluminum. And if it's substitutional, the misfit just isn't all that big, and the solution hardening can be big enough to be useful, but it's not going to be that big. Where you get significant solution hardening is when the solute is an interstitial, because interstitials are atoms that are trying to fit in little bitty holes. They don't fit very well, and as a consequence, they have a big strengthening effect. The classic one, which is responsible for a not insignificant fraction of all of human technology, is carbon and iron, which gives you steel. Just a little bit of carbon does a dramatic job of strengthening the steel because of its strong interaction with precipitates within the steel. There's also in fact, we just sent a paper into Science this week on the effect of oxygen in titanium. The other thing that can happen is that these solute atoms can get down here right on the dislocation line, in the dislocation core. And depending on the nature of the dislocation, that can have a surprisingly large effect. One of the cases that where you see a really big effect of interstitial solutes hardening of the order of carbon and steel is oxygen in titanium. Almost pure titanium is hexagonal. You put in a tiny bit of oxygen and the strength goes shooting up. And that's been a puzzle for a very long time. With some combination of first principles calculations and atomic resolution microscopy, a group that I'm associated with Andy Miner, has I think proven that what's really going on is that the oxygen atoms get sucked into the dislocation core, right around the core of the dislocation itself, and the distortion of the interstitial sites near that core is such that it's very, very difficult for that atom to separate, for the atom and the dislocation to separate. And as a consequence, you get a very, very strong strengthening effect. It's interesting in part because it's not an elastic interaction, it's a crystallographic interaction. Dislocation hardening. Here, the dislocations, we talk about forest dislocations. We're trying to move a dislocation along this glide plane. The dislocations that intersect the glide plane will interact with it and make it rather difficult for this dislocation to move. They're called forest dislocations. And the kind of universal hardening law is 3 beta c to the 3 halves. This is the Taylor factor, beta c to the 3 halves. Turns out to be about 0.3, and sigma y is about 0.3 GB square root of rho, where rho is the overall dislocation density. Work hardening dislocations multiply during strain. If you the work hardening coefficient, the change in strength, yield, true stress for yield against true strain. If I just use this sigma y as alpha GB root rho, then the d sigma to e, the work hardening rate, will be alpha GB over 2 root rho d rho to e. So the work hardening is due to the increase in the dislocation density with the strain, and that gives you the work hardening rate that is shown here. And as I said, this is a universal law that works surprisingly well, even though we're relatively ignorant of the details of how all the dislocations are really interacting with one another. The other thing that can happen, and does happen at high temperature, is that dislocations of opposite Berger's vector can annihilate one another. The simplest example is here. Consider 2 edge dislocations. One of them has the extra half plane above the glide plane. The other has the extra half plane below the glide plane. These will attract one another because their tension and compression fields will be reversed. When they do attract one another, they will, 2 dislocations with the same sign will repel. 2 dislocations of opposite sign attract because their tension and compression fields are flipped. And when they get together, the 2 extra half planes at their edge dislocations just merge. So the dislocations annihilate. Now this is the process, this dislocation annihilation, of course causes rho to go down and causes the strength to decrease. And in a couple of the laboratory experiments that you did, when you observe recovery, you observe materials get softer as you anneal them. Part of that might be grain growth, but also a good part of that is that if you heat a material up to high temperature and hold it there, if you anneal it, the dislocations interact with one another, they align and they annihilate. So the dislocation density comes shooting down, and as the dislocation density comes shooting down, the yield strength does as well. So this is a major softening step, this dislocation annihilation. Work hardening, I guess I already showed you that. So finally, precipitation hardening. Precipitates, if we take them, the precipitation hardening is very important in particularly two classes of materials. Aluminum alloys, aerospace aluminum alloys in particular, are almost all precipitation hardened. The other place, and I'll talk about this again in just a moment, where you use precipitation hardening is when you're trying to develop high temperature materials, so things like turbine blades, because precipitates can survive and function at much higher temperatures than dislocations or solutes can, as far as hardening is concerned. What happens when you age a material? If you plot the yield strength as a function of time, you get curves that look something like this. It increases to a maximum and then drops off and goes the overaging condition. What's going on here is the following. I take a material, supersaturate it with some solute, then bring it into a two-phase region so I begin to precipitate out these particles. Initially, at the very beginning, these particles are very small, and they will almost certainly be coherent with the crystal lattice, because otherwise you get big elastic and surface energies involved. So we start out with precipitates that are not that effective as barriers to the dislocation, because the dislocation can cut through them. However, they are initially, there are an awful lot of them, because they're very small and because the volume is distributed over many small precipitates. So we do get some effective hardening from them. So you see the hardening start out at some reasonable value. As you age the material, just give it some time, these precipitates are going to begin to grow. As they grow, as they coarsen, yes, there are fewer of them, but the ones that are there are stronger because they're bigger. It's harder for dislocation to get through them. The critical strength is going up. So we have a gradual increase in strength during this aging phase, primarily due to the coarsening precipitates raising the precipitate strength, making them difficult to cut through. However, there is a maximum to the strength the precipitate can have. It's called the Erewhon limit, and it's kind of illustrated up here. Suppose the precipitate becomes so big or so strong that it is impossible for the dislocation to cut through it. So we bring dislocations up to these super strong precipitates, and what happens to them? The dislocations get pushed through. Eventually, as we raise the stress, this dislocation arc becomes a semicircle, and then it starts ballooning out on the other side of these precipitates. So the arms of the dislocations will actually approach one another and come together. Since the two dislocations on the opposite side of the precipitate, with a little bit of geometric squinting, you can see that they have opposite character, because the dislocation line is running down here and up over there. These two arms of the dislocation, when they meet one another, they will annihilate. So what happens if the precipitates get real strong, and you can observe this in PEM, is that the dislocation will approach the dislocations, bow through the dislocation arms will annihilate one another, they will move forward, but they leave a loop behind. So there's a little loop of dislocation left behind the particle. Well now, ideally this would give us an obstacle strength of 1. However, the obstacle strength never gets that big because the arms of the dislocation actually attract one another. So as they start pinching out here, they attract one another, and that facilitates them getting together and annihilating and pushing forward. But there is a limit here, this Erewhon limit, to how strong a precipitate can be. It's a Vega C of about 0.7. Now what implications does that have for age hardening? Well, that tells you that initially, as you coarsen the precipitates, as they get bigger, they're getting harder for the dislocation to go through, the strength is going up. But once the precipitates get to be impenetrable, coarsening them leads you to softening, because the strength of the precipitates can't change anymore, and as they get bigger, constant volume, the density of precipitates or the spacing between them is going down. So we age to peak hardness, and after peak hardness, we get into what's called an overage condition, in which the strength actually decreases with time of exposure. Now this can be a real effect. Well, one of the things it tells you is that the maximum hardness that you can get is going to go with the volume fraction of the precipitate phase. Because what I want to do is to get the precipitates to such a size that they just become impenetrable. That's where we get to the peak of this curve. And I want that to happen at a maximum value of the density n. That means a maximum value of the volume fraction of precipitate phase. So if I just look at the phase diagram, any typical phase diagram, the lower in temperature I go in my aging, the higher the fraction of the precipitate phase. The lines that border the phase diagrams always slope toward the boundary. Go to lower temperature, you get a bigger fraction of precipitate, meaning you get a higher hardness. The problem is that precipitate coarsening is governed by diffusion. The lower I go in temperature, the higher hardness I get, but the longer time it takes me to get it. And the actual age hardening treatments that are used are optimizing the trade-off between these two factors. You want to be low enough in temperature to get really good hardness, but you want to be high enough in temperature that you get it in reasonable time. You also have to be somewhat careful that the precipitate phase that you are using is stable enough that coarsening is negligible at the temperature in which you're going to use the material. There's a classic case of that some years ago. We were involved in a program with Alcoa. It was the development of age-hardened aluminum lithium alloys, and we were looking at certain defense applications. And it turned out that some of the alloys that Alcoa was proposing, we were working on, for those applications would not work. And the reason they wouldn't work was that if you were to, or at least not for some applications, if you were to try to use them on the leading edges of any part of the aircraft, you had to recognize that you're talking about military aircraft, and it must be assumed that they're going to fly supersonically and spend some of their operational lifetime in the supersonic regime. When they get into the supersonic regime, frictional heating from the air becomes significant. So there's going to be some exposure of these alloys to relatively high temperature. Think of the problem of the space shuttle coming through the atmosphere, or a meteorite coming through the atmosphere trying to get back down. So you had to design alloys or choose alloys that would not overage during the thermal exposure associated with supersonic flight over the planned service lifetime of the vehicle, and that turned out to restrict the alloys we could use. So overaging is a problem in inappropriately treating an alloy. It can also be a problem in service if the service involves some exposure to high temperature. I once actually did a PhD qualifying exam, this was many, many years ago, of a student in our department who was coming in with some new steel that she was proposing for use in a very high temperature application. And the temperature at which the steel was being proposed was something like 650 centigrade, and her aging temperature was 550 centigrade. And we said, young lady, have you really thought this through? And she had to go back and try again. She did eventually. You make mistakes like that. We all do. And, you have to think it through. It's, all right, now here's a major factor that determines the strengthening mechanism, and that's temperature. If you take virtually any material and plot its yield strength as a function of homologous temperature, temperature divided by the melting temperature, you get a curve that looks about like this. At low temperature, the stuff becomes very strong. Intermediate temperature, it goes in a long plateau, and then at high temperature, above about half the melting point, it starts to degrade. And you get close to the melting point, the strength becomes very low. What's happening here? Down here at low temperature, what's happening here is that dislocations, like everything else, are in a medium that is undergoing thermal vibrations. So the dislocations vibrate, and the dislocations can activate past these obstacles. You can get past the obstacles by being physically forced through them, or you can get part of your activation from thermal excitations. Now, how hard it is to excite something past an obstacle depends in part on how big the obstacle is. If we're down here at very low temperature, solute atoms can be surprisingly effective. Maybe not great strengtheners, but there are a lot of them, but they're very small. It's easy for a dislocation to bypass a solute atom, or even to drag the solute atom along with it, if temperature gets to a significant value. So if we're down here at low temperature, we get short-range barriers. The solute atoms are the simplest example. There are some others, but solute atoms are the simplest. And down here at very low temperature, those become active, and we get high strength. Once we get to a reasonable homologous temperature, these solute atoms become relatively ineffective, and the other short-range barriers become too, because it's just too easy for the dislocation to thermally activate past them. Then we're left with dislocations and precipitates. Dislocations and precipitates are much larger in extent, and therefore it's much more difficult for them to be bypassed by thermal activation. So we have this intermediate region, which is where most structural materials are used, where the yield strength is relatively independent of temperature over a significant range. And here, dislocations and precipitates are the principal hardening mechanisms. You get up to higher temperature, you lose your dislocations via recovery, your precipitates start coarsening. Even if you make your precipitates big, the dislocations can now climb as well as glide, so they can maneuver around them. So out here, you start losing your strength. In this high temperature regime, about the only way you can get good strength and keep it, you've got to have big precipitates, very large precipitates. They've got to be based on substitutional solutes, so their diffusivities remain rather low and they don't coarsen. And then you can get decent strengthening at high temperature. So the high temperature structural materials are all precipitation hardened, and they are mainly what we call nickel-based or moly-based superalloys. They are hardened by large precipitates which employ substitutional species with very low diffusivities, so that they coarsen very slowly. They're big, so dislocations have great difficulty maneuvering around them. They're substitutional, so they don't coarsen at a reasonable rate because the diffusivities of the species that are in them are very low, and we play all kinds of other tricks that I don't have time to tell you about to stabilize those precipitates so that we can get good materials at high temperature. And that's a very important story in material science. I think I mentioned to you the first jet airplanes, the engines had a total lifetime of 30 minutes. With modern alloys, after more than a half century of development, you put a new GE or Rolls-Royce engine in a plain Pratt & Whitney engine, you fly it 100,000 miles before you even open it up to see if there's any problem inside. And it's all because of the development of high temperature materials and coatings that give us high temperature strength and preserve us from oxidation at high temperature. Okay, I've got a little bit more to tell you about plastic deformation, but I'll put that off until Monday, and then we go to fracture, which is the last subject for the course. See you then.